Hello and welcome to another episode of the Agile Uprising podcast. My name is Niklas Kari, and this non-North American accent is brought to you all the way from Finland. My co-hosts today are Mike Cadell. How are you, Mike?
Doing well. Howdy, y'all.
Hello, and Janelle Lanza. How are you, Janelle?
Hi, it's great to be here. Happy to be a part of this discussion.
Great. And we are today joined by our guest, Christiaan Verwijs. I'm sorry if I butchered the pronunciation of your last name. You can.
Perfect.
Happy to correct it. So Christiaan, welcome. Can you tell the audience a bit about yourself and what you do?
Yeah, sure. And of course, another non-North American accent because I'm from the Netherlands. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me in your podcast. It's very nice to be able to talk about the topic we're going to talk about how to bring data and science and evidence to the discussions in our field. But I'm Christiaan Verwijs. As I said, I live in the Netherlands with Lisanne, my wife. I've been working in the Scrum Agile community for 15 plus years now. I think I kind of stopped counting, but for a long time. And it mostly started because I'm a developer. I really love building products, and it's something I started doing when I was like a teen, and I'm still doing it today. I mean, before this podcast, I was writing some code for a platform that we're building, and I really like that. But because of that, I also really connected well with Agile and Scrum principles. I have a background in software engineering. I have a background in organizational psychology. Kind of a weird combination at the time, but these days it makes a lot of sense also for the discussion that we're going to have, I think. And I really appreciate the scientific perspective that I've been taught. I like to bring this to my work too. I have a company called the Liberators together with Barry Overeem, who is my business partner. And we've had that company for, I think, 5 years now, quite a while. It's been a blast. We're just a 2-person company trying to make a worldwide impact. Also based on scientific evidence that we're doing a lot of research ourselves, and we're trying to spread that research and engage more people to do it. Also academics to engage with us on this. But that's something we can talk more about in the rest of the podcast. I think that's it for now.
Okay, awesome. That sounds great. So basically you have a consulting business and training business, or?
Yeah, well, honestly, I have no idea what kind of business we have. We always sort of we try to do what we like doing. And it's been a training workshop kind of oriented business for a long time. But since COVID, we also started building a product called the Scrum Team Survey, which is something that I'm spending most of my time on now. But I think it's like organizational consultancy, helping teams be more effective. Yeah. That's the core mission.
And we'll be talking more about the Scrum Team Survey today as part of our discussion. So we kind of have two topics here. What kind of sparked this discussion was that last November, you wrote an article, Is SAFe Really That Bad? Which caused quite a lot of discussion in the community, even some controversy, you could say. So we want to discuss that with you. And then secondly, we also want to spend a bit of time to understand the role of research in the Agile community. What kind of value can it bring to the community? So you have I think quite a unique perspective on these things, and it will be interesting to see, where our discussion will lead us. Okay. I think we all know that in the Agile community, there's from time to time debate about different frameworks and approaches to Agile and agility. And in particular, SAFe is something that the Scale Agile framework it's not universally loved, and it arouses some passionate debates about is it Agile or is it a good thing or bad thing, or where does it work, where does it not work? So Christiaan, you did something unusual in this debate. You came armed with some data to provide your perspective, or at least one perspective to SAFe and maybe also other frameworks. So and that with the help of that data, you wrote this article that is SAFe really that bad? So could you please talk about the research you did and for this article and what your conclusions were?
Yeah, of course, I'd be happy to. And let me also emphasize that I'm really interested to hear your thoughts and your what are the questions that it raised for you? And so please just jump in and ask them. well, I'm sharing the findings from the post. But what I've done basically, and I've been doing this for a while now, is to try to apply an evidence-based perspective to questions that I have as a practitioner of Scrum and Agile. And I've actually done this for a number of topics, but scaling frameworks are, like you said, very popular in our community. So that was a topic that resonated very strongly with a lot of people. It's kind of sad for the other topics, which I think are also very interesting, but less controversial, I think. So a lot less attention spent on those. But basically, my question was based on my own sort of gut feeling about SAFe and LESS and other scaling frameworks, is that my gut feeling is that they are a very complex solution to something that benefits more from a simpler solution. That's my gut feeling as a practitioner. And I've not been verbal about this on social media because it's just a gut feeling. I don't think there's a lot of value in that. So Barry and I don't think have ever written much about SAFe or LESS or other scaling framework because it's mostly our gut feeling. We have some experience with them, but it's a mixed bag, basically. But I thought, let's try to collect data and see what the data says. Now, I already mentioned that I'm building a product called the Scrum Team Survey. It's a platform that teams can freely use to diagnose themselves and get feedback from our tool. And we collect a lot of data with that platform. I think today we're at over 10,000 teams, so that's a large database. And then we also ask a lot of different questions that allow me to answer questions like these. So, for example, we ask teams and their organizations, what scaling framework do you use? So this basically allowed me to compare teams from organizations that use different frameworks on a number of core factors that we know from scientific research are important to team effectiveness. And I can briefly name them. They're stakeholder concern. So do teams actually work with stakeholders? Can they respond quickly to changing needs, which is responsiveness? Can they improve continuously? Do they have a climate of continuous improvement? Do they have autonomy to take control over their own work? And to what extent do they have support from management? So I compared teams from different organizations with different scaling frameworks on those 5 core factors. We didn't find a big difference. There was a small significant difference, but very tiny. I mean, it was negligible almost. For all scaling frameworks. So it wasn't just SAFe, it was LESS, SAFe, Scrum of Scrums, your own invented framework, no scaling framework at all. There was no meaningful difference between any of those. We also looked at stakeholder satisfaction. So we have a separate questionnaire that teams can send out to their stakeholders of different types of stakeholders. And we ask those stakeholders questions about the quality of the work that teams are doing for them, the responsiveness of teams, the collaboration that they feel with teams, but also the value that teams are delivering to them. And also there, we didn't see a big difference. In this case, we're talking about, from the top of my head, about 2,500 teams, I think, and about 400 stakeholders. We've actually been rerunning the analyses recently with a larger data set, which hasn't been published yet, but even with 3,000 teams representing 11,400 team members and 544 stakeholders, the results are mostly the same. So still not any meaningful differences. So those were 2 perspectives, like stakeholder satisfaction is not very different. The core factors of what make teams successful are not very different. I also looked at other scientific studies that have been done in the field, which unfortunately is not that much, because for some reason, academics are not really interested in comparative analysis. They are just looking to understand things. But also there, I couldn't really find evidence that one framework is much better than the others or much worse than the others. And I basically wrote a blog post to summarize those findings, not to say SAFe is not bad, even though that's the title, but I tried to pick a somewhat provocative title also.
Yeah, of course.
But yeah, it's sad, but that does work better online.
Yeah.
But I wanted to show more okay, this is my gut feeling. Is it actually supported by the evidence? And in this case, my conclusion for me is it's not supported by the evidence. Apparently, teams that use SAFe can be just as about effective as other teams that use other scaling frameworks. It's not SAFe in particular. It's just that SAFe is a big, how do you call this? It's a fire starter for discussions online usually.
Yeah. Mike, I think you have a question.
Yeah, Christian. So I'm curious, in the survey that you created, are the different categories either defined or presented or communicated? And what I'm curious about underneath that question is to what extent the responses could possibly be context specific as opposed to the same or similar, and does that make a difference, or how does that possibly inherent bias then influence the data and the possible conclusions?
Yeah, that's a good question. Do you have an example maybe of a category where you're expecting a
so
difference?
I'm thinking of stakeholder satisfaction and team autonomy as a couple. So as two possible ends of the spectrum could be a smallish company that has very nimble teams where the teams make many more decisions about the product and about how they work and what documentation they create, as an example, or it could be many different things. That's one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is a very large organization, maybe one that's been around for 100+ years, works in a highly regulated industry, and has a rich legacy of top-down control. And to a team in that organization, autonomy may be as simple as having a voice in the discussion where the work they're being mandated to do is determined. And so looking at the two, it has the same label, but is it the same thing, and is that relevant?
I think it's relevant in the sense that this is always something you want to rule out as an explanation. The way, for example, let's pick team autonomy, the way we measure team autonomy, and maybe just a bit of background on how we measure this stuff in the first place, is we have a questionnaire and it's about 70 questions or something. It's a bit more actually. And for each topic that we measure, we have a number of questions, and then we sort of triangulate the actual score from the answers that people give on those questions. So for team autonomy, we actually ask questions about self-management, which is a sort of a sub-factor of it. And we also ask questions about cross-functionality, which is the ability of teams to actually bring their skills together in a way that helps them achieve their goal. And I think your question is mostly concerned, I think, with self-management. The questions we ask there are things like, does your team have control over how they do their work? Or to what extent do they have control over how to do their work? Or is your team able to schedule their work? And yeah, I suppose it's possible that in a very large corporate, the same level of autonomy that people experience actually means something different in a very small company. But I wouldn't even know how to control for that in a measurement, because how do you know, right? Ultimately, what we're trying to measure is behaviors in teams, like what kind of behaviors happen there. And I would say if a team is capable of scheduling their own work, for me, they have high autonomy. And if they're able to control how they do their work, like what methods they use to do their work, then I would say they have autonomy. At least that's consistent with what research says about how to define autonomy in teams. The same goes.
So you have a definition that you.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. There's actually, which is interesting maybe for the listeners, that there is a scientific publication also that we did on the model that's behind the survey, the questionnaire, where we sort of outline the definitions and how it ties into existing research, how we validated the questionnaire, how we ensure that we're measuring the same thing. But still, I think it's always good to look for better ways to measure things. So yeah, there is a potential that it might mean something else, but I haven't seen any signs of it, because the thing is, you kind of, for everything we measure, we don't see a difference. And I would expect that if, for example, team autonomy in particular is experienced very differently in very large organizations than in very small organizations, then I would expect to see only a difference there. But we're not seeing difference in any area, like climate of continuous improvement, like psychological safety in a team, the ability of teams to learn new things, the morale of teams. So in this case, then you would have to sort of you have to figure out how is it possible that everything is sort of the same across these different teams. But like I said, it's a good question. I don't have a way to control for it at the moment.
Yeah, I understand. Just understanding that there's a consistent source and definition or evaluation criteria.
Yeah, and what we actually do, and that might actually help a little bit, because one of the challenges that I have with publishing stuff like this, I mean, the study we're talking about right now is not peer reviewed yet. We're in the process of doing that, but that takes like 2 years. It's very slow. But one of the things that's really important for people to realize about questionnaires like this is that we are constantly using statistical techniques to identify which questions are not consistently measuring something. There are statistical ways to do that, and we actually remove those questions. So the moment we see that one question is answered very weirdly or inconsistently, then it's automatically removed, or not automatically, but I remove it from the questionnaire and replace it with something else that is more consistent. That's the way we try to ensure reliable measures. Is it perfect? No, it isn't, but at least it's a good start, I think.
Yeah, no system of measurement is perfect.
Yeah, exactly. I was just about to add to that, and certainly my impression is that you are way more thoughtful than 99 point something of any like research I've seen about in the agile space. So certainly I think this is a like very good effort. I think it's also important that your background is not like safe or less or anything like that. So kind of like the flavor that if you would be a safe fellow or might be that you might be a bit more biased than you are in this case. So I think while it's certainly possible there's some like bias that kind of is unaccounted for, I believe this is a very credible result you had here.
I hope so. The peer reviewers are also looking at it, and I'm not sure. I haven't received any feedback yet, but this is what they will look for. Like, is there potential for bias and issues? And the other study that is the foundation for our questionnaire has already been peer reviewed, so we've actually already gone through that process with them.
Is that the 2021 now Mida and I can't even pronounce Esaphinia? I'm sorry, I butchered those names.
I'm not sure. What are you referencing, Mike?
The other study you just mentioned, was that the Almeida and Esaphinia?
No, it's Verwijs and Russo 2023. It actually was published officially last month, even though we already made it available 2 years ago. That kind of shows how long it takes.
Yeah. But I think this was an interesting question about the methodology and the potential bias there. Unless we have like some other questions about like how the study was done, we could maybe jump into the conclusions a bit deeper, because I think you had some like interesting thoughts. And, what does it mean? Why are there no differences there?
Mm-hmm. And your question, and what's your question about that?
Yeah, if you could just talk about the kind of conclusion that you made based on your paper, because I think that's quite interesting.
Yeah. So like you already said, I'm not a SAFe practitioner. I mean, I've worked in organizations that apply SAFe and LESS and Nexus and all the other scaling frameworks. I don't have a stake in a particular one, but like I said, I started my investigation with this gut feeling that scaling may not be the best solution to the problem that scaling is trying to solve. But I think what I sort of realized from the analyses is that even though it's a complicated answer, or not maybe, but like maybe all this talk about scaling frameworks is not the best way to spend our time and effort, because a lot of attention goes to that in our community. Maybe other factors are actually more important in shaping how effective teams and organizations can be. And just to give you a number for this, in our more recent analyses of the data set for the SAFe paper, we also calculated something called the explained variance. And this means that you can basically calculate how much of the variance in team effectiveness or stakeholder satisfaction can be explained from the choice of scaling framework alone, if everything else is equal. And it's about 1 to 2%. So it's tiny. And if you look at other factors that are important, for example, are teams actually able to talk with stakeholders? Then you can see that that's usually 5, 6, 7, 8, 10%. The core factors that I mentioned earlier, like responsiveness, continuous improvement, team autonomy, stakeholder concern and management support, together, these factors explain about 70%, 70, of team effectiveness. So those factors are statistically at least far more important. And maybe scaling frameworks have some influence on them, but if we control for that in our results, it's still only 2 to 3%. So I would say that we may do well not to spend that much time thinking and arguing and discussing frameworks necessarily, and focus more on what actually happens in teams and organizations that try to apply all this stuff. I think that's a conclusion that I drew from this investigation. But I'm curious to learn what your takes are from this.
In general, you are quite experienced working with many organizations. So what's your feeling about those conclusions?
Well, and in my introduction, I didn't say that I'm an executive coach and have been a practitioner in different methodologies for a long time. And I'm currently a senior consultant in digital performance, where we survey teams to understand the best ways and what is the current state of your software delivery teams? What is the current state of the teams you want us to survey? We also get context. We don't just do a survey. We have data scientists and engineers helping us with it. It's really fun. So I'm really enjoying the conversation. So yes, there's a lot of discussion and argument out there, and I think it's healthy to a point. And as a reader, you know when to walk away, when you're not getting value anymore from the conversation, you're not getting a new perspective. It's time to just, it's the same old song and dance. But I do believe you're onto something with what are the conditions that need to be present for any change or transformation to take place. So it can be the most supported, sponsored change or transformation ever. But if the conditions aren't created to help that transformation happen, it really does not matter what it is. So it's like conditions for Scrum. What do we need to have happen for that to grow beyond that one little team that saw success? Scaled Agile, same thing. They're not the same thing, but the conditions behind it, I believe there is something to that.
I really like that you also bring in something like Scrum, which is also a framework, but in practice, there was actually a nice question from someone that said, isn't it important to measure how consistently teams are using Scrum? And you can ask that question also of SAFe and LESS and all the other frameworks. But in my experience, Scrum always looks different. Whatever team I go to, it looks different. It's never exactly the same because teams are different, people are different, organizations are different, products are different. Well,
and when they can't get the value doing it the way Scrum says, they do it their own way and say, this is how we're going to do it.
Yeah, and perhaps that's fine.
It's a thing.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I like that you're also bringing that data-based perspective to these discussions. It's really useful. I think in general, maybe that's the biggest conclusion of my series of blog posts where I try to bring more evidence to certain questions. I wish we had more of this in our community, and that it was more common Nicholas, you said it in the introduction, that I did something pretty unique, which is nice for me, but it's also a bit sad, if I'm honest, that it's not very common in our field to bring data to a discussion. I think we can all benefit so much more and create so much more impact if we actually take more effort to bring some evidence to the table. That's not just our gut feeling or what's provocative on social media. That's my big hope. Yeah.
And of course, I guess the fundamental issue is that it's easy to have some experience that what worked or didn't work in some context, but it's more difficult to have these surveys and kind of be rigorous about collecting data. I want to ask you about one thing. So you said that the frameworks explain 1 to 2% of the success in any case at most. So does that mean that you should not use a framework? You should kind of just figure it out yourself, or do you think that frameworks actually have value, and if they have, in which case do they have value?
Right. That's a very provocative question. I would say do what works. And I know that this is a very agile coach-like answer, like it depends, but maybe it's more like do what works for you. If it fits in some organizations, something like SAFe will be more meaningful because it uses terminology that is already sort of familiar to some of the people in the organization, or because it reflects things that already happen. I don't think that that's a problem. I mean, for some people in our community, that's part of the problem of SAFe, but I don't think that that's necessarily a problem, because you need to start somewhere, and you cannot expect a big corporate organization to change everything they do and just use Scrum and nothing else. So I would say do what works. And I would also say this to teams that use Scrum. Use what works. And if you need to change it, change it. But it's a helpful guide. It can point you in a direction. And if you deviate from it, make sure you understand why you're deviating from it. And maybe don't deviate from it the very first moment, but deviate from it when it starts to not work in certain areas or get difficult. That would be my answer to your question, I think. But it's a half-formed thought, to be honest. So I'm really curious about your thoughts.
Well, at least one thing I could refer is your own article here. You talked about kind of like matching the mindset, existing mindset of the organization, and the framework.
Yeah.
So that's I thought that was like an interesting idea.
I think that's important. And then also we have a lot of companies and customers and teams that work with SAFe or in SAFe organizations or less, or one of the other frameworks. And that's what we also sometimes hear, like, let's just start with SAFe and we'll see from there, because that's easier for us to get started with because it already gives a lot of ideas for how to do governance, for how to do long-term roadmaps and so on. And it may not be perfect in the eyes of very experienced agile practitioners, including myself, if I'm honest, but maybe that's okay. And that at least focus on all the other factors that I mentioned and that we already talked about.
Yeah. Kind of like, is it agile enough for that company at that moment, or is it good enough for that company to take a step forward?
Yeah, or a good starting point, I would say. And I'm not sure, are you familiar by any chance with, that's really fascinating work by, I'm going to butcher their names too, but de Kaluwe and Vermaak, two psychologists, business scientists. They're from the Netherlands, actually, but they have this color theory of change. Does that ring a bell?
No.
When you say you're talking about color theories of change, my mind goes to Lulu and
that's. I don't know actually what came first. I think the Kaluwe and Vermaak may be a bit older, but it's more like they have more of a philosophical framework to think about. How do people think about change? How do they approach and understand what change is? And they identify a number of colors for it. And you have blue, which is very much focused on structure. And the assumption there is that change follows structure. So if you change the structure in an organization, then change will happen. But they have other perspectives also, like change follows power, which I think is yellow or red. It's yellow. Yeah. So if you change power structures in an organization and you build coalitions, then change will follow. You also have like change follows learning, which is green, or change is unpredictable and you cannot plan it and you just have to seize the moment when it happens, which is white. And so these are different colors and different ways to understand change. I think in general, in our professional community, there is a very strong emphasis on blue, to the detriment of the other perspectives, because I don't hear a lot of people talk about power and power structures and how to build coalitions, how to, even the word manipulation is a dirty word in our community, even though part of a yellow perspective on change is that you can find ways to bring people over to your side in a positive way. Manipulation doesn't have to be bad, but that's something that I think is also very interesting. Also, like, to what extent do changes actually address personal needs and motivations that people have? That's actually red in their color theory. There's very little talk about this in my mind. And I think the over-reliance on the blue perspective makes us all very focused on frameworks, which is also why most of the training and workshops are about frameworks. But I think these other perspectives are very useful, maybe even more useful, but we're not talking enough about that.
Yeah, I think that's very...
If we could maybe find a a link to the work that Christian just mentioned, and
Yeah, I'll share one with you.
See if we
Yeah,
can include that in the
we
show
will put
notes.
it in the show notes. Yeah, and maybe kind of a segue from that, but or tangent from that, but coming back to the question about what's the value of frameworks, I guess one in some situations when you have to especially when an organization is quite new to agile and you want to and there's like an interest to start a larger transformation. I think what the frameworks can bring is some credibility to it.
Mm-hmm.
That it because when you talk in agile terms, it can sound like it's some kind of a religion, for the management that is not like necessarily very familiar with all the nuts and bolts of it. So then it's good that you have some case studies that in our industry there's some other companies doing this and they are using say for less or something else, and you get that credibility to kick off the thing and kind of show how the pieces fit together that makes sense to someone in the C-suite or also.
And also like frameworks, scaling frameworks like say for less may actually fit better with existing power structures. They may fit better with the personal needs of the different levels that are involved in a change. So that's also why I think it's not necessarily bad. But if you only take a blue perspective to change, then your assumption will be, let's just not do safe and do this other structure that's more effective in my mind. And then everything will be okay, but it's never that simple.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, or it's not always that simple, at least. So
well, in my experience, it's always very hard. Even with an individual team, it's hard, but a lot of fun. Yeah, but I'll share a link to the Callaway and Vermaak. I think it's very useful to get acquainted with those different perspectives. It also helps us understand more about some of the weaknesses in the discourse in our community, but also the strengths that we have. Like we're very good at blue. That's a big strength of our community.
Exactly. Yeah. All right. Mike, Channel, do you have some questions at this point? I will have one, but if you have something in the back of your tongue.
Yeah, I think you kind of touched on this earlier, Nicholas, but there was a passage from the article that we're referencing here that really resonated for me. And that was this, organizations do well to seek a framework that fits the mindset already present and not to impose one that is very different. So safe or less or Scrum at scale or whatever may work well in one organization, but not at all in the other. And that I think that's a very useful insight. And it kind of gets to the some of the underlying psychology behind how people will process change.
Exactly.
And I'm curious, is there anything that you saw in the data to further elaborate on that conclusion? Anything in there?
Well, for me, it was not. I have to dig deeper into the data at some point because I have more things I would like to answer with it. But one of the things that I think was just the most interesting for me was that I didn't see any big differences in the first place. And I think some of the things that I found enlightening was also in the comments that followed after the post. Of course, there were some people that were critical of it, which is fine. I mean, we should be critical of things that are challenging our beliefs. But there were also a lot of people in the comments that were basically saying things like, finally, someone says something that I'm also noticing in my work, that it doesn't really matter all that much and that you have to just pick what works for you. And I think it's also nice that a more nuanced perspective, which I hope to bring in the analysis that we've done, can also create more space for people to feel comfortable that, okay, safe may not be perfect or less may not be perfect, but it works for this organization and that's fine. Because if everyone is basically bashing on scaling frameworks all the time, you make a lot of people feel bad with all the memes and all the things that people say. I mean, my LinkedIn timeline is pretty much filled with memes like that, and I don't think that that's very helpful.
Yeah. Okay, good. I think we could maybe like make a segue here to talk about research on Agile in general.
Yeah.
Unless I mean, we can of course, if like in general you have some questions still you want to specifically ask about the article, we can still certainly come back to that as well. I guess we could just start with general questions. So how do you see the role of like research in this space and the value it can bring to the community? So I guess we touched upon that a bit, that we can have more sound arguments and so on. But how would you like pitch it for us?
I've been asking myself the question a long time now. Basically, what happened for me is, I think 5 years ago, or a bit less actually, I think 4 years ago, I was working with Barry on a number of classes that we were developing, workshops and training, and we were thinking like, what's the actual impact of training on behavior? Like, does behavior actually change meaningfully after you go to a 2-day class? And I started reading up on this, and there's actually an interesting topic in its own right for another time. And basically that was the moment where my scientific training reawakened, which had been dormant for a while. And I started digging into some of the other questions that were on my mind, like to what extent is team size important to how effective a team can be? The size of an organization, does that actually make a difference, or can Scrum work just as well in a small organization or a big one? I have many questions like that, but I was mostly interested in what can actually make a team more effective. I don't even honestly care that much about Scrum, but it can be a helpful guide for teams. What I'm more interested in is how can we make teams more effective and which factors contribute to that. So I started looking into scientific research in that area, which was actually, there is actually quite some research in that area, which for some reason is not really reaching at least my part of the professional community, which is, I think, sad, because there are a lot of academics spending time on it and professionals spending time on it, but they're not finding each other. So I started collecting data on my own, and I thought, well, let's just create a survey. Teams can participate. I can collect a data set and hopefully start answering those questions. And then I was approached by Professor Daniel Russo from the University of Aalborg, who has been my partner since then, my scientific partner since then. And he basically asked, can I analyze the data that you're collecting? Because it's pretty rare to have so much data on teams. And I already had done some analyses. I shared them with him. And he was like, well, we can publish. Let's go ahead. And that was the first publication that we did. And from there, basically, we did all these other things. And what I think in general, scientific research can bring to our community is more evidence, like what actually works, what doesn't work. And I think it can bring more nuance, because scientific research, usually the answer is like, in most cases, it's this, but not always, or usually it goes like this, but not always. And I think that kind of nuance in general is very good to have. Also, I think a lot of scientific research is always interested in what are the variables that are important for a particular effect, like an effective team or an effective business or happy team members. And which variables actually influence each other, and how does that work? And I think understanding which variables are important can help us draw attention to those factors. Psychological safety is like, even in the data, it has a humongous influence on effective teamwork. If psychological safety is low, it really goes down quite dramatically. So this is definitely something to spend a lot of time on. And I think that those kinds of insights we can get from scientific research, and they can shape how we work with teams and how we actually make more effective teams. That would be the value that I see. What about you? What do you think?
Well,
Go ahead, Janelle.
My colleague, the data scientist, was just in Australia for winning best paper at the International Conference of Software Engineers.
He was at ICSI,
and
nice.
It was all about Western culture and burnout. So this is a topic very near and dear to our group at Digital Performance. And having been in some uncomfortable situations as an employee, I was an internal consultant for years. So it's not like I'm an out of touch consultant running around at different companies. I mean, I've felt the pain as an employee over the years, and sometimes understood it, and sometimes just all of us wondering, like, why is it like this? You know, or we knew enough. But so anyway, yeah, the thing about this is, there's two different ways to look at this world that we're in, at least in North America, where economy is a little tight, maybe a lot tight, depending on where you are and what region. But sometimes paying for a survey or making teams, even if it's an internal thing where we have to set aside time to work on this, is somehow like there's a paradox there where part of it's like, don't you want to do more with less? Don't you want to see the improvements that you can do right now with what you have and take a step back? And then there's the other part of that's like, we don't have time for this. And my favorite saying with that is, I don't have time to learn how to swim. I'm too busy drowning. And so there's this thing where we have to work with teams, and teams have to work with their management to make the case for why now is important to have some new data, or to look at the data we did. We did a survey 2 months ago and we haven't done anything with it. So there's the time factor, even if there's no money at that point. And so that's the thing we see a lot. And that I've experienced as a team member myself, where we did something and it's just, back in the day, we called it the Dead Sea Scrolls, rolls of giant sticky notes in a closet somewhere that we're not going to get back to those. And maybe we should.
That's so recognizable. I remember those drawers, like you pull them open and there are like tons of stickies. Yeah.
So I have a lot of empathy because I think we're talking about something that can sometimes feel really big or out of reach for our listeners. And I want to just like try to make that connection that I hear you and that this is a difficult time and that there still might be an opportunity if you have the right repeated conversation. Maybe not, but try not to give up. But our listeners know your culture best of when it's time to say when and back off versus go ahead and then find yourself in a place you maybe don't want to be.
That's perfect. I really like that. Yeah, and I fully agree with that. That's very true.
Kind of along similar lines, you were mentioning earlier, Christiaan, the number of different variables that influence outcomes. Something that I tend to run across a good bit is organizations struggle with attribution. So, your way of working, how does that affect the bottom line? And what are the other influences on the bottom line? And reliably and believably, how can I pull out the effect of this one change or set of changes compared to other things completely out of control? And what I've myself and a colleague have been doing some work recently with trying to isolate on specific characteristics, specifically around flow and lead time, and leading then into more of the Don Reinertson cost of delay, as opposed to maybe what some others may hang the term cost of delay on. And so we're trying to isolate to the extent possible. And attribution is tough.
And how is that working? Are you making progress on it, or I'm very curious.
Situationally, we're making some progress. In one recent example, myself and this colleague worked with an organization for about 6 months, and by doing some simple categorization of work items, we're able to illustrate how, regardless of anything else that was going on, they were spending somewhere upwards of 93% of their effort maintaining a platform that was riddled with technical debt. I hate to use that term at times, but and what that simple metric did was then it opened up the door to the conversation that we really need to have, which was about how decisions were being made about where to invest time and what were the factors that were playing in on those decisions, which ultimately led to a kind of a heart-to-heart with a senior leader, and kind of supporting that senior leader through kind of the grief stage of, I have to tell stakeholders that I can't do everything that they possibly asked for. So kind of connecting a bit of the data perspective to where ultimately the real challenge was, which was helping a person in a senior position think his way through how he could tell stakeholders bad news and still be okay with it.
Right.
Oh
wow, that's a lovely story. Also because it shows, I think, two things that are really helpful in general. Like the first thing you mentioned, like how do you deal with attribution? Like how do you know that the variables you're investigating actually cause the effect you're seeing? And I think that that's one of the reasons why it's helpful for our community to work more with academics or people with academic training in general. Like they are often trained to think in those terms. They have methods for it, to control for it, maybe statistical techniques. That's super helpful, I think. And the second thing you mentioned, which I think is really important, is that ultimately it's about the conversation, right? That you created the opportunity for a conversation with management based on the data that you collected, the things that you found. Ultimately, data are just numbers, but you have to talk about it. And I think that that's the strength of it. It at least gives you a stronger foundation for a good conversation. Yeah. Also about the things that are maybe not convenient, right?
Yeah. And what I've, my lived experience has been that to get the information to do proper attribution takes work, and it takes time, and kind of to feeding off the point Janelle was making a little bit ago, it's common that organizations are struggle to take the time to do the work to get the data to be able to inform discussions and ultimately decisions. When there's, I can't speak to the rest of the world, but here in North America, there is a very strong societal bias towards give me the pill to make the quick fix at times.
Same here.
So you can't medicate away bad organizational practices.
When I think about who are the players that are good actually with research in the agile community, actually kind of like I would say maybe unfortunately, it's the strategic management consultancies, because they have done that a long time. They hire people that are very good, often like researchers, and kind of their business model is predicated on having that credibility in the C-suite and on the board level. And one of the tools they use is their own proprietary research, which they do, I think, in a similar way that you do at the Liberators. So they do surveys and they collect data from both public and their own surveys to kind of tease out these interesting correlations that what drives companies' performance in different industries, and they might have something that companies that in this sector that were forerunners in adopting agile, they outperform on some measure their competitors, and that gives them credibility to talk with the C-suite and kind of initiate those discussions that maybe we should also try it. So my kind of dream is that also the more pure play agile advisories would do more of that type of research, or at least that's something I've been thinking about. What is your take?
Here, totally. Yeah, actually, every time someone posts something on LinkedIn about collecting data, I usually place a comment like, if you need help with the analysis, just let me know. If I have some time, I'll do it for you or with you. I don't need money for it. It's just let's make our professional community better. I've actually helped McKinsey a few times in this regard too, because I know some people there and they've really well-skilled Scrum Masters there. I actually helped them analyze their data also, and they have a lot of data. And I think in general, if we can, my dream would be for there to be some kind of open source like foundation where there's a lot of data that's openly available that can be used for research questions like the one we're talking about now, but also other kinds of questions. And I don't think there is something like this. There are some organizations that share some data, but not all of it, or what they can share with privacy law, of course. That's something we have to honor as well. But that would be great. And for us to have as a community some people who can analyze that data in a meaningful way, because that does require a skill set that requires training and experience. So you need data scientists, statisticians, people with research methodology, who understand research methodology, but also people who can communicate the findings, because that's one of the things that a lot of academics struggle with, is how do you actually communicate something that's pretty nuanced and complex. So there's a lot of opportunity there, I think, to move our community to the next level. And I'm happy to contribute to it, however I can. We're already sharing our data on Zenodo for people who want to analyze it themselves. But if more people would do that, that would be awesome.
We start to approach the end of our time, but Mike and Janelle, do you have some last question or comment you want to give?
I want to thank Christiaan for bringing a data perspective to a very emotional topic, and also I'd be remiss if I didn't thank you, because I recently wrote a kind of a marketing insight for my company, and referenced and linked to your articles. So
that's great.
So thank you.
You're welcome.
It's a pleasure meeting you. And while we didn't really dig into is safe good or bad, I think we had a solid discussion on data and some different perspectives on using that in work. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Yeah. I think we have to do another episode on this to answer the question of your article. But now we have some more data, at least, about it. So thank you very much for that. Christiaan, is there some event or some other shootout you would like to give out?
Yeah, I want to mostly thank you for inviting me and having me over and spending about an hour with me to talk about this. I mean, this is great. And this is always what I hope for when I write a blog post about something like this, where we can actually dig a bit deeper into it. And we didn't answer the question, but for the question, is safe really that bad? I think actually thinking about how to answer the question is more useful than actually answering the question. Yeah, so thank you for that. And obviously, I want to thank Daniel Russo, who's my academic partner, who is from the University of Aalborg and helping me with all this research. And of course, all the teams that are contributing their data to it, because without them, we cannot even run these analyses. So if you can join with your team as well, that'd be great. We have more data, we can answer more questions, but you can also use other tools, of course, the same purpose.
To the question of is safe good or bad, I'd offer the parable of the farmer. Good or bad, hard to say.
That's nice.
Yeah, that's nice. So Christiaan, what are the best ways for our listeners to get in touch with you if they want to reach out to you after this?
The best way is to just send an email. You can send an email at info@theliberators.com. We can also connect on LinkedIn. I'm easy to find, Chistiaan Verwijs, and then you'll just see me pop up with the bow tie, I think, on the picture also. All listeners can see that I'm wearing a bow tie. But that's an easy way to connect. And I'm always happy to help people that have questions about the research that we're doing, or have questions that they think can benefit from research. Feel free to reach out.
Awesome. Thank you very much. So on behalf of the Agile Uprising, we would like to offer sincere thanks to our guest, Christiaan, for volunteering to spend time with us. On behalf of all of us on this episode, we'd like to thank you, the listeners, for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a review, a rating, or leave comments on iTunes, Stitcher, or your podcast platform of choice. It helps others find us. And if it's your first time tuning in, why don't you subscribe to our podcast? There will be a thread about this podcast posted on coalition.agileuprising.com, so feel free to hop in and join the discussion. We also have an active Discord community where we discuss all things Agile and adjacent. In the show notes, we'll provide a link to our Discord server. And then lastly, we do have a Patreon set up for those who would like to help us cover our hosting and production cost. You can see the show notes for details on how you can become a patron. So until next time, this is the Agile Uprising podcast signing out.